Welcome back to another episode of the Cycle Breakers podcast. Today, I am very pleased to be joined by Patricia June Vickers, who is a trauma therapist, an artist, and a healer from the Eagle clan of the village of Gitsala. Apologies if I've mispronounced, but you can correct me, in British Columbia. Her healing practice weaves Western neuroscience with Indigenous law, ceremony, and language, creating a path that honors both clinical precision and ancestral knowing. And just that intro alone has me so excited to learn more from you, Patricia. And I just want to give you the warmest welcome to the podcast. And thank you so much for being here today.
Thank you, Rachel. The village I'm from is Gitcatla.
Okay, wow. I did not do that justice. I apologize.
That's fine. Um, and I say that's where I'm from because the people of Gitcatla adopted my mother into the
Mm,
Eagle tribe.
mm.
So that's why, even though I have my paternal grandfathers from Heiltsuk, Bella Bella,
Ah,
and yes, my paternal great grandfathers from Haida Gwaii. But I say I'm from Gitga'ala because we're matrilineal and we follow the woman. So
well,
that's
thank
why I say I'm from there.
well, thank you for that. And it's so interesting. There's a couple parallels. Haida Gwaii keeps coming up for me. I have heard from peers of mine and other Indigenous women, there's something very magical, very special about the land there. And we can say that about a lot of our ancestral territory. But Haida Gwaii, I have heard, is something else. And it has come up for me so many times. And I feel like you mentioning it again, there's something pulling me. Maybe it's this year, maybe it's in the future, but to experience the medicine of the land there, and I'm sure you can attest to that, having relations and connections there from your lineage. But yeah, I'm very excited for this conversation, and I want to start by allowing you to introduce yourself, and for anyone who's kind of being introduced to your work for the first time, yeah, I'll let you introduce yourself in your own way.
So I started by saying I'm from Gitga'ala and why I'm from there. I say I'm from there. Um, and I grew up when I was born, I'm the sixth of seven children. And when I was born, the family moved from the village of Gitga'ala to Gitsan territory to Hazelton, more specifically to 2 Mile, which was 2 miles from Old Town, still is 2 miles from Old Town. And so my first 7 years were in Gitsan territory, looking at Mount Stigioden, which is, you talk about land and power and land. I think the whole Northwest is like that, but definitely the confluence of the Skeena and Bulkley rivers is a powerful place. So I grew up there and the first 7 years, and then we moved south into Coast Salish territory on Vancouver Island. And that was back in the 60s. That was quite a shock to
Mm,
move from the north to the south. I'd seen a television once.
wow. Wow.
I'd never been in an elevator and I'd never seen an escalator. So moving to the city was really something else. It was a good life, actually. I preferred the north to the south. The land Gitsan land is something else. Yeah.
Well, thank you for that. And I mentioned to you, the reason that we were connected is through a mutual connection, Dr. Gabor Mate. And in the conversation I had with him a couple months ago, he recommended you and recommended the documentary If an Owl Calls Your Name, which you have a pretty significant contribution towards. And I am very grateful that we've connected because in watching the documentary and in learning more about your story, it's deeply empowering. And I'd love for you to share a little bit about that story. You talked about early life, growing up in the Northwest and then eventually moving south. But within your story, as um, memorable as it may have been in some ways, there was some pain, and you can share as much or as little as you want. But I think there's a lot of medicine in the story of what you endured and where you are today, and the mission that you're on to support healing. And so, can you share a little bit more about that? And again, whatever you are compelled to and comfortable with sharing.
The land for me and the power in it, the spirit in it, was vital because I was growing up at a very young age with rape and incest. So, and as a clinician, those who I've worked with over the past 30 years, the significant moments of regulation for clients has been in the bushes in a golf course in the city, or again in the city, leaning against a tree before going in to be beaten by the father, who was a residential school survivor. So the, that's why the power in the land is important for all of us. I think too that one of the big hurdles that I faced was in my mid 30s when intergenerational incest was disclosed by my eldest daughter. And we did speak about our healing in our relationship and untangling that chaotic mass of intergenerational incest and the important not so much principles as actions, I suppose both principles and actions in a relationship. And that's when we need to have a foundation. And ancestral law gives that. But I wasn't taught as a child directly about ancestral law. My mother was a missionary, and she was also paranoid. So, however, it's true, she was neglectful, that she didn't intervene when she needed to. She never intervened at all. And the rape was throughout my entire childhood. So, however, she was a kind person. In society, there's a tendency to, when we're looking at, say, my father, who was diagnosed as a pedophile, then they're classified as a monster. And it's not true. They're a human being. And so we all have within us these good, solid qualities and these qualities of suffering and that repeat suffering. So I didn't get that in the religious teachings from both my father also was Christian. Both my parents were. So growing up with incest distorted that spirituality for sure. But what I found is, even though it was distorted, that was the foundation, along with the power of the land. And we need that spiritual foundation for transformation to have its way in our life. And I certainly needed it for it to have its way in my life. So the big hurdle was believing that because because my father was an Indian, and in the 60s and 70s, that's what we were called and what we called ourselves. I had believed I'd carried shame, and I didn't see that I was socially conditioned to carry that shame. So I would say that was the first awakening for me to see at 36 when I was in treatment in Arizona. There were 75 was the maximum, and there were only 3 of us of color of 75. All the other white people were struggling with similar issues. And one woman came in to, you go into direct observation, or you did back in 91 first. And she had nightmares every night. She was hollering. And I found out from other patients that her father was a pedophile, and he was a pediatrician. So I came to see that it wasn't true that incest was an Indian problem. I came to see that incest was a human problem. So that was the me awakening. At that time I didn't call it social conditioning, but it is a part of oppression, and that spiritual war that we're in to constantly be claiming our humanity as Indian people or First Nations people or Indigenous people because of oppression. So I would say that was probably my next challenge, was bumping up against that. And thank God I was in treatment with so many white people and was awakened to that lie that's a part of cultural oppression. So what a great beginning for my healing journey to go south to one of the top treatment centers in North America. There were people from around the world there. And actually, when I arrived, there was a multimillionaire woman in her late 60s, early 70s. And she was driven there from one of the southern states by her chauffeur. And there she was ironing her clothes in the laundry facility. So it was really, it was quite the experience for me. It was called the Meadows. It still is the Meadows in Wickenburg, Arizona. So I would say that was the beginning of a profound awakening for me. But I needed more than that. My brain needed help. That helped me to understand with the mind the suffering and the nature of the suffering, the roots of suffering that I was living in. But for change to happen for many of us who are second generation, you're third, my children are third. So generally the trauma is a little less. And of course, for residential school survivors, they're first. And my father was, and his mother was a residential school survivor. But I then began to see that I kept struggling with the shame of having to struggle to find my sense of value and worth. And I understood that I was struggling, especially with rage as a mother. It's a horrible, horrible thing to struggle with rage, to be apologizing only to rage again. And using shame, not intentionally, but conditioned to use shame to teach and direct. and what a horrible thing that is, because we all have a conscience, and and just being aware that even after treatment, I wasn't where I wanted to be, but not understanding what more I had to do to find peace and really to know what love is, because I certainly knew the distortion of love. And I had wonderful glimpses into love as a child, but I wanted more. And it wasn't until, so that was 91 that I went through treatment. And then in 2006, I learned, because I went for counseling with my brother who had raped me in childhood and his friends. We went to therapy together. And that's when he had said how many times I was raped. And I had memory of once, twice. I didn't have memory of all of these other times. So that's when I learned I had dissociative amnesia. Mm. So because in counseling, the training that I went through, we weren't looking at the brain. And so I did somatic experiencing later in early 2000. So learning that I had dissociative amnesia and that my brain was doing something that I couldn't control, I then looked to two psychologists, colleagues, Ulrich Lanius and Steve Milstein. And I asked them, what can I do? I have this, and I'm headed for a second nervous breakdown. And I want to continue helping others to heal, but I'm crashing. And so they said neurofeedback. And that will help. In particular, it was LENS, which is low energy neurofeedback system, specifically designed for dissociative disorder. So beginning to regain memory in 2017 was a horrific thing and a remarkable that the brain is an organ that can change. And so that was the beginning of my brain changing. And we look at, there's this book out, Sensory Pathways to Healing from Trauma. And they've returned, it's Ruth Lanius and a number of other authors. And they've returned to this triune brain, where first is the survival brain, and that's mainly where I was living from, and the emotional. So those two in this cycle of survival behavior, emotional behavior, are emotion tripping me back into survival behavior, so that there isn't much in the way of reflective brain. So it was wonderful for the engagement, a greater and greater increasing engagement of being able to reflect. In other words, to integrate all this memory that I was gaining, to see how deeply depressed I'd been for a long time without medication, and beginning to understand the rage that whenever I was bumping up against powerlessness, then this huge explosion, because the next thing with experiencing powerlessness was rape. So the brain is doing this survival thing of here's powerlessness, and so this explosion in an attempt to prevent the horror that was next. So it was really something to be able to see that and to begin to relate to myself differently, to begin to have compassion and understanding for myself, not excusing myself, but to understand.
Wow, Patricia, that is what a journey. And I want to unpack so many aspects of that journey because I think within it, despite, where you're at today, I think the journey to get to where you are today, it doesn't seem like it was linear. Like many of our healing journeys are here, there, and everywhere. And then we finally find for you, the modality and the pathway that is best for you. I can resonate with that, and I'll touch on it just momentarily. But I think going back to when you were in treatment and being one of three colored folks in that treatment center out of 75. And I think, the incest that you experience, recognizing that's not an Indian problem. And then also whatever other expressions of trauma, whether it was alcoholism or drug addiction or mental health concerns, also recognizing like it's not just an Indian problem. And so often it's labeled as, the drunken Indians, and we've got all these problems, and it's like an us problem, right? Where a lot of that systemic and yeah, a lot of that systemic shame comes from is, we've been conditioned to feel like we're the problem, and maybe less, like you said, in my generation. I know for sure in my mom's generation, her father was a residential school survivor, so she experienced more of the trauma that I would have experienced, but still, nonetheless, I have experienced many layers of complex trauma as a result. But I think that is such a beautiful perspective for you to have, that awakening and that awareness while you were in treatment. So that was one piece that really stood out to me. And then the dissociative amnesia. Are you able to explain that a little bit more for anyone listening who may not know what that means or what that entails, just for a bit of context?
Well, first of all, dissociation is when we involuntarily leave our body because we're not able to manage or regulate our whole system because of the horror that we're in. So it's unconscious and it's involuntary. And then when that happens repeatedly, the brain takes charge and puts up a roadblock. So, but the thing is at 10, I remember when the rape was often and more than one male raping me. I remember walking to school and looking up to the sky and praying to this unknown God to make me forget, because I remembered everything up until I was 10. Isn't that amazing? So it's not only the brain, I think it's those little prayers that we pray as children. And so that's dissociative disorder. And then dissociative amnesia is about the brain taking over, putting up a roadblock, locking a door. And so there's no ability to access that memory. So what neurofeedback does, in particular lens, is it mirrors the brain and what the brain's doing. And the mind needs to be set with the intention to recover memory. There also needs to be that, and there needs to be an agreement within self to do that. So, so that's how I began to recover memory. Wow. That was otherwise impossible, just not possible to remember.
Wow. Okay, we're going to get into more about neurofeedback because I'm really curious to get into that. The one other thing that I really want to touch on, because I think the experience of shame is very common, and you've touched on how shame creates silence, and then how that silence exiles parts of us. I think that was something I took directly from If an Owl Calls Your Name, and that really stood out to me. And you described how shame, showed up in your parenting, it showed up in your personal life, and again, I
Partners I chose.
partners, yeah. And so, I mean, I don't know exactly the question I have, but I think just talking about that shame, and I think acknowledging, identifying shame, and for me, shame has been a big theme in my life, a huge theme, and one that I've only probably around the time that I'm 38 now, so it was around 36 that I started having this new awakening of these deeper layers of trauma, and a lot of it was shame. A lot of it was ancestral, generational, a lot of it childhood related. And so I think having a conversation around shame and how this impacts our sense of self and our sense of safety is important, because it is a very relatable and a very relevant conversation. But I think because shame makes us want to isolate and shut down and silence ourselves, we don't tend to put words to it.
I would say there are two aspects to shame. I don't know that they're two different energies of shame, but when back in the 90s, John Bradshaw wrote a lot about shame, healing the shame that binds you. How I understand it today is there is that healthy shame of, oh, that was arrogant of me. I see myself and I go, oh, that was arrogant of me. And then I feel that little bit of shame, which is gives me the gift of humility. And I say, oh, I don't want to be arrogant. I don't want to be a know-it-all, because it's not true. Nobody knows it all. So there's that shame. And then there's, I would say, the curse shame. And that's that spiritual darkness, alienation. It exiles. It had me believing lies that I wasn't of value, that the life that I was living was what I deserved. I deserved because I'm a failure. So I would say that shame comes from, it's a part of a curse, and it's a manifestation of a curse within us. So yeah, of course, as Indigenous people, those of us who are from a line that occupied and were tending the land thousands and thousands of years ago, of course, that curse shame is a part of our core because of social conditioning, because of cultural oppression, which is first a spiritual act. So there was I think her surname was Smith, and she was from New Zealand. The first one that I saw in the 90s with the book out, Decolonizing Methodologies, I think was the title. And so deconstruction and the prefix D was a big deal in back then in the 90s in academic society. And what I came to see and what I believe today is that there's no such thing as decolonizing, because the colonization is a curse for both people, really, for both people, because it's about dehumanizing. And so the one who dehumanizes, so my father, who was dehumanizing me through rape, and the one who is dehumanized, which was me, both know that reality, both know that curse, both know that spiritual dark energy of being a slave, being held in captivity. So I think that to me, it just makes sense. So many of our people that I've worked with, that you identify has been the big struggle, and it's like the mother root of all the suffering.
So from there, like identifying this is the root for many of us, and segueing into the work you do, because I think it's brilliant, needed, necessary, relevant. How does understanding, the neurobiology of trauma, the brain reorienting, the neurofeedback, somatic experiencing you mentioned, even I know the beautiful thing about your work is then weaving in the ancestral law. How do we begin reconciling with that shame? I know you also talked a lot about the art of forgiveness in your healing journey, and so where do we go? We've identified this shame. I've identified this shame. What's our pathway forward to begin reconciling and then repairing the shame that we're holding?
Or inviting repair.
Inviting repair. I like your language. Yeah.
Yeah, because it's inviting transformation. Repair is transformational. Yeah. And that's what we long for, that's what I long for, is to be love. Because I know what hatred is. I know what greed is. I know what resentment and bitterness is. I know what it is to have all of those poisons in my gut and to feel helpless with it all. So I know what it is to be a prisoner to that curse. So I think that's important, is to be able to name it and to recognize that we're in need. There's this big knocking of the 12 steps that's been going on for a while. I love them. I'm not one of the people that's going to knock the 12 steps. Oh, sure, it can be cultish and it can be rigidly religious. Of course, because human beings are involved with it. But I love the mystery part of the 12 steps. So I definitely came to a place of seeing that I was powerless over the incest that had me bound and what I couldn't remember. So I think that owning, truth telling to ourselves is the first step, and me seeing that I'm a part of a tribe of people who want to know what love is, who want to live love, to be love, and that there are others on this journey. I think that's a really important aspect of it, to know that you're not alone. And also that I mentioned there was the humility, shame, and then there's the curse, shame, and to not, this is where we must do that personal work. This is where the discipline comes, when that dark shame arises that tells me I'm worthless, that I'm nobody, that I have no value, that I deserve the suffering I'm in, for me to say no to it. And when I first say no, I might not see anything else. I might not see what beauty means or what love means or what having personal value means. I might not know any of that yet. And that's okay because it's still all there for all of us. That sacredness, that we're all sacred. So coming to that place, and we have ceremony. We have so many ceremonies that help us to claim freedom and to own freedom. That's what they're there for. Our ancestors also struggled spiritually. So they've given us wonderful, wonderful ceremonies to help us to let go, to deny, to refuse the curse in our life. And we certainly need each other in order to do that. That's what I love about the sweat. It's not our tradition as Tsimshians, but it's a really beautiful tradition. So is the pipe. They're beautiful traditions. I believe first in the teachings of Christ because that's about the doctrine of love, not the religion. I don't call myself a Christian because of what that means. But the teachings themselves are profound transformational teachings. And it's not like Buddhism where it's this step and this step and this step and all laid out for you. Uh-uh. You have to meditate. And for me, I had to refuse theology. I had to rest in our language and how our people see things in order to understand those teachings. So our belief in the supernatural is important, and that's what I call it. And I that's where going to ceremony or going to 12-step meetings or whatever it is you choose to do, that community is a really important part of our healing. So right now, you and I have a little community, this little community of you and me. Yeah, and the value in it.
Beautiful. I like that perspective. And I am fortunate as part of my reconnection journey to be able to attend ceremony with my relatives every season. And that is it. That sense of belonging, that sense of community that I get from it that I didn't realize was missing until I had it in my life, and how often I isolated as part of my trauma. That hyper independence. I don't need anyone. I got this. I can do it on my own, or on my own, and a lot of time in isolation. And it wasn't until recent years that I recognized, oh, this is a trauma response of I'm feeling some kind of way within myself, and I'm shutting out and shutting down everyone around me and disconnecting myself from the source of love, like you mentioned, which is so beautiful.
A shame response.
Oh,
Also,
totally.
the shame curse response. All those behaviors that you described. Yeah.
I've identified that. I think I remember distinctly the day where it was this aha moment, and I saw it as a pattern finally. Whereas it was just so ingrained as part of, oh, this is just who I am. I like my alone time. And I'm then aware of, oh no, this is me isolating and creating disconnection and separation because of, yeah, shame and other complex emotions. So a large part of your work, and you touched on it, is this neurofeedback. And you described how when you began to understand how your brain was changed because of the trauma, and how modalities such as neurofeedback, and feel free to add in any other tools that have been beneficial that you now work with. But I'd love to hear more about neurofeedback, and I'm sure many of the listeners would as well, as a pathway to healing, and then helping us to understand the ways that trauma, and I know there's so much we could say about this, but the way that trauma changes the brain, and what that means for us and how a tool like, say, neurofeedback can support us in repairing.
There's a great 3-minute video out there by Bessel van der Kolk. I love it. I've used the video in our trauma trainings that Ravenscall has done. And he goes over 3 ways in which trauma changes the brain. And maybe you can send that information to listeners. But if they were to search on YouTube for 3 ways trauma changes the brain plus Bessel van der Kolk, they'll find it.
I'll link it in the show notes and they can easily access it because I love his work. So I wanna watch that as well.
So I think what's important too is that when we're looking at 2 aspects, we're looking at intergenerational trauma and we're looking at, let's say, developmental complex trauma. Those are 2 different. And I would say that most of us live with those 3, the intergenerational, complex, and developmental. So what does that mean? It means that I'm living life in survival mode. And there's this sense of being a prisoner to living life in survival mode, which is fight, flight, freeze. So we're either hyper regulated, where fight, which tended to be me. I was a fighter. Or we're living in hypo mode, which is in this constant freeze space. So, and of course, I wasn't always in fight mode. It depended what the perceived threat was. It was also hypo. So that's how trauma changes the brain. We're living in hyper or hypo. We have what's called, and comes from polyvagal theory, Stephen Porges. There's a video out of him describing polyvagal theory, where our window of tolerance, when before neurofeedback, my window of tolerance was pretty narrow, which means that I was in hyper or hypo state. So calm wasn't very easy for me, or alpha state, which is the calm state. And so after I did lens and finally, what's the word to use? Jolted into the truth of my childhood history. It was horrible, and I talked to no one about it because even my colleague found it difficult when I was describing what was happening, the memory I was regaining. Eventually I saw him like cringing. I saw the tension in his body as I was describing the experience that I was retrieving. And so I journaled by painting, because I think it's important for us as we're retrieving this part of ourself back again, that we've part of our soul back, it's soul retrieval work, that we take the time somehow to communicate with ourselves about this healing change that's happening in our life. I think that's important. Neurofeedback really helped me to see that it wasn't about me as a failure or me as a dirty person. That neurofeedback helped me to see that my brain did what it did as an organ to help me to survive. And that's why I think it's so important for our people. Because how can you do somatic experiencing work or deep brain reorienting if your brain is it can't come to this place. So I've seen as a clinician, when people go through neurofeedback that's training the brain into alpha, they can face memory. Instead of hyper or hypo, they're calm as they're talking about horrific stuff.
Wow.
So I think that it's important. I use a particular system. I don't use Lens. I use a system that's called EEGER, EEGER. And I went through the Australian Neurofeedback Institute training. There is a biofeedback, BCIA. It's a certification, Biofeedback Certification International Association. So right now, that's the big body that we go through. So the training that I did through Australia was certified by BCIA, by this international association. And then after I purchased EEGER, then I went to Massachusetts and I was trained in how to use EEGER, just introductory training. And then I spent 2 years treating myself, because that's brain training or brain treatment, and friends and family, and learning how to use the system. And so what you pay attention to is sleep, your circadian rhythm, sleep, and your gut, because people with trauma have a lot of gut issues, and your mood. So you're emotional. I was saying how my emotions would, instead of reflecting, I would go back into survival behavior. So you're paying attention to sleep, gut, and emotion, mood. And what we want to see over time is an improvement in at least one of those. And I've worked with friends, and they've noticed a change after 4 sessions. Yeah, that's not usual. I think that's a person who's keenly aware. They went through long COVID, and then got health help. So they're really keenly aware of their body brain. But what I noticed with a different system, it was Mind Lift Muse 2, and Ed Hamlin, who's a neuroscientist, psychologist from the States, he recommended, when I did a project on Haida Gwaii, that's what I use, because the learning curve wasn't as intense as EEGER. So, and boy, was he right. So I did what was called alpha down, which inhibits a person going into alpha wave. So it's like this: your brain's being inhibited for a half an hour workout, and then you go away and the brain goes, oh, and it relaxes, goes into alpha state. So that it takes about 25 sessions, 30 sessions to see long-lasting brain change. And you're looking at anywhere from $2,500 to double that.
Wow.
Yeah. So right now, I think for neurofeedback, it can be incredibly expensive, which isn't a great thing if you're living on the street, or if you're in poverty, or if you're skilled but you're unemployed because of trauma. So how do we, my big thing when it helped me so much was, how can I get our people trained so that we can help ourselves using this? And I think that's the next big challenge is how can we work so that it's more accessible to our people, and really to anybody who's living and suffering with trauma.
Thank you for that. My question is, so 25 to 30 sessions, let's say, over what length of time would that be? Like, do you have sessions weekly? How long are the sessions?
Yeah, depends what system you're using. With Eager, your session would be about 40 minutes. So you'd block an hour. And when I was using the Mind Lift Muse 2, it was 2 sessions a week, which Ruth Lania says, oh, that's ambitious and brave, because people are going to they're eventually going to be facing the horror. But when I use neurofeedback, I use brushing off and grounding ways. I really appreciate Frank Corrigan's deep brain reorienting. So with DBR, you're aware first of tension in your body and where that tension is. Because when you were a child, that's the first thing that happens, is you orient first to where there's threat, and then tension happens in your body because you're bracing. And then there's the fear or terror, and then the shock. And that place of shock is when anyone's in shock, emotions, there's no access to emotions. There's a shutting down because it's survival, and then coming out of the shock. So that's deep brain reorienting. You're following the tension, because the tension, TENSION, is what leads you to the memory.
So with neurofeedback, would you is that then where you layer in once you've done, say, the soul retrieval, the memory retrieval? Is that when you layer in other modalities to support then the integration and the processing of that? Or
First is the neurofeedback,
okay.
because the brain needs to be know what relaxation is. The brain needs to know, and the mind needs to be in unison with the brain to know what it feels like to be relaxed, and to know that you can find that state. So once you know you can find it and that your brain can do this, then your mind begins to work together with the brain.
Wow.
And so working on really deep intergenerational issues, for some people, you're not going to get very far. It's going to take a long time. Whereas when a person learns how to find that relaxed state, then they know they have hope for themselves because they can find it. It's like home that's a safe, beautiful place.
Yeah.
So when you know you can find home in yourself, then that safety, then you can face the horror.
I love hearing about this because I'm all for alternative and I know we're at time, so I'll be mindful of us wrapping up here in just a moment. But I think it's really important to highlight these different modalities, these different pathways to healing, and also even you've mentioned it's yes, you're starting the process with the biofeedback with that, and then there's the additional layers, and there are the 12-step programs, and there are so many amazing pathways. And I think it's important that we explore and experiment and find what works for us, because sometimes we need something a little bit more manageable to start the healing journey, and then we can go into some of the more deeper layers, right? Your healing journey didn't start with um, the biofeedback, but when you found yourself there, it was at the timing that it could really land. And I think that's important for our peoples to know there are options. And my one fine, I'm sure I have so many other questions about this, but with the neurofeedback, is it an in-person type session? It's not something that could be virtual, right?
There are different programs that you can do at home with a clinician. I wouldn't recommend it, knowing the history of so many of our people. I would not recommend that, the in-person. And you can go to a technician who does neurofeedback, or you can go to a clinician who does neurofeedback. So there's a difference between the two.
Okay.
Yeah. In a clinician is trained to help you to self-regulate through different methods: somatic experiencing, deep brain reorienting. Yeah, I would say those two are big ones for me.
Well, thank you. I think it's so fascinating. First of all, the story and the journey that you've been on and where you are today. And you're a testament to this work. Like have you've done the work. And I think you're doing, yes, we're always on it. I know. And I feel the same. We're never at that finish line, because I think part of the journey of life is to be on that ongoing pathway of yeah, learning and unlearning and healing. And yeah, I just think your story and and what you've been through and where you're at today is such a testament. I think you are your mission. Like I want to get the mission out there, and hopefully through this podcast more folks are aware of this work and aware of the availability of it, and hopefully that then creates pathways of greater accessibility, because I think this is our way forward. Like these are the tools and the resources that we need to be aware of, to be made aware of, so that healing is possible. We talk about the impacts of the pain and the trauma, and I'm on a mission to, yes, acknowledge it, but let's talk about the generational healing. Like let's talk about the well-being, the generational well-being. And yeah, thank you so much for shedding light. I know we could have probably talked for a lot longer, because I have a lot more follow-up questions. Maybe we have a second conversation, but I just have follow-up questions for my own personal interest, because of the work I do. And I'm like, oh, like how could I learn more and be a part of this? Because I think that's what you're getting at as well, is I want to be able to pass this information and train others in this, and they can then carry that torch and create that ripple effect. The final question, well, there's two. Number one is, where can we find you in your work? And I'll link all of that information in the show notes as well. But yeah, where can we find you beyond this episode?
I'm focusing more on, I'm a spiritual director as well, and I'm beginning to focus more on that than myself as a psychotherapist. So people who are interested, I do have a website, and you'll have it linked. So Raven was a transformer. That's why it's Raven's Call, even though I'm an eagle. And what was your other question?
Oh, just yeah, where we can find you and your work. So I'll link all of that in the show notes for sure. And the final question I ask every guest is, what does it mean to you to be a cycle breaker?
I don't think of myself as a cycle breaker. I think of myself as a fellow journey journeyer and someone whose goal is to be love and to give love. So I want to end by sending these words out to people who are listening, that you find that healing light, that you find it within yourself, that others who also carry that healing light would cross your pathway, and that you too would know the depth and beauty of love.
Miigwech, such a beautiful way to end off on in a good way. And again, truly grateful for your time, for your energy, for your medicine today. And I, yeah, I'm looking forward to uh, hopefully connecting further outside of this and experiencing some of the medicine that you offer. So yeah, chimigwech, and we say bama pi.